Hello, my name is Emma, and I wrote my paper on whether or not 3 of the specific films in this class validate the Turing test. Essentially, the premise is that you have a computer in one room, you have a human in another room, and a moderator asks them both questions. They respond with typed answers, and if the computer can convince the moderator that it is the human, then it has passed the Turing test. Essentially, it's the same test that was proposed by Alan Turing in a 1950 paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And in that paper, he asks the question, can machines think? And then says, that's a hard question to answer. And he substitutes that with this test, which he calls the imitation game, and then spends the majority of the paper defending the validity of that substitution. So essentially his argument is that if a machine can indistinguishably imitate human thinking, then we should say that it can think. He looks at a couple different ways of defending that, and 2 of the big things he looks at are whether or not a machine can have a consciousness or needs a consciousness, and whether or not a machine can have a soul or needs a soul in order to say that it can think. So looking at the films in this class, kind of within those 2 criteria, I wanted to look at whether or not science fiction validates the Turing test. So the first film was the 1927 Metropolis. It was a silent German film from before the Turing test, before computers, before any of that. It featured one of the first robots in science fiction. That robot's name was Maria, who was kind of based off of the human character Maria in the film. And so the portrayal of robots in this film suggests one side of Turing's argument on this, that a robot does need a soul and does need a consciousness, but it can be given that. And so the robot Maria, in a scene with kind of science and magic and religion all intertwined, the essence of the human character Maria is kind of transferred onto the robot. So in that sense, this film validates the Turing test that a machine can think. The second film, Blade Runner, also agrees with Turing's arguments, but from kind of the opposite standpoint, and actually the arguments that Turing says he agrees with more, that machines can have a consciousness without it being divinely given to them in some way, and also that they just don't need a soul. There's kind of a Turing test-like test in the film, so there's humans and replicants. Replicants are kind of the genetically engineered robot of the future. The replicants are kind of gauged on their emotional response to questions about things like cruelty to animals and that kind of thing. But it's interesting because that's contrasted in the film by scenes where humans witness cruelty to other humans, brutal violence, and they react with very little emotion. And so the themes in Blade Runner suggest that machines don't need a soul because humans don't have a soul, and it's kind of a dark Cold War era film in that sense. The final film that I looked at was the 2001 anime version of Metropolis. It also features a central robot character named Tima, as well as some other robots in different kind of classes in the city, similar to the workers in the original Metropolis. Other than that, the storyline is actually fairly different. The themes of soul and consciousness are really not looked at all in the same way. The creation scene with the robot was kind of very minimal in this film. It wasn't really addressed a whole lot. And the idea is almost given that the soul and consciousness, the ability to think, aren't necessarily a humanly inherent thing, and so it's not a difficulty for the robot to have this, which could have roots in kind of the traditional Japanese religious idea that an inanimate object can have a soul. So this also supported the Turing test in the sense that a machine can think, because these other things that bring it to that point aren't necessary. That it shows that science is not just some lab experiment that's independent of the world affects science and science affects the world. Yeah, just the philosophical and questions about humanity that come into that. Also the way that you see things from science fiction coming into real science now. Science fiction in film was a really interesting course to take as a STEM student, partially because most of my other classes are just taken with all other engineering students, and there was a lot of different majors in this course, and because it was very discussion based, you got to hear a lot of different opinions on the films things that you just wouldn't have thought of. Like watching Arrival, there was some really interesting discussion about kind of the environment that the aliens lived in and the biology and just things I would never have thought of, so that was cool. Another thing I like about science fiction in general, the creativity that you get to see in science, because people don't necessarily think of science as a particularly creative field. And so yeah, just how all of those things are intertwined. I think science fiction shows a lot of that.